How often do we assume that what feels friendly to us feels the same to someone else? It is a quiet question, the kind we rarely stop to ask. Most days, we move through familiar routines with confidence. We smile, we wave. Familiarity has a quiet power. When something repeats without disruption, the mind begins to relax. It stops scanning for risk. It fills in the gaps with reassurance. In this story, the routine mattered more than any single moment. It shaped expectations. It softened doubts. It created a sense of belonging where no clear agreement had ever been spoken. The visits followed a pattern that felt harmless. Arrival was unremarkable. Departure was predictable. In between, there was stillness. Time passed without urgency. The absence of conflict slowly became evidence that everything was fine. For one side of this connection, the routine carried meaning. Showing up was an act of care. Sitting nearby was a sign of respect. Remaining quiet felt considerate, even gentle. The lack of words was not a barrier. It was simply part of how the connection existed. Others who observed this pattern saw it differently. Some felt uneasy, not because anything specific happened, but because they could not explain the connection clearly. When something resists explanation, people often assume it is merely unconventional, not dangerous. Over time, concern fades into acceptance. Routine has a way of dulling instincts. There were moments that might have stood out if they had happened once. A look held too long, a reaction that felt slightly off. But repetition blurs those moments. What feels strange the first time feels normal by the 10th. And after that, it feels expected. This is how warning signs become invisible. Not because they are hidden, but because they are absorbed into the background. The environment reinforced that sense of safety. Open spaces tend to calm people. Shared areas suggest oversight, even when no one is truly watching. When others are nearby, the brain assumes balance exists, that someone else would notice if something were wrong. But shared spaces also create distance. Responsibility feels spread thin. Everyone assumes someone else is paying closer attention. Inside this routine, emotions quietly diverged. One side felt comforted by consistency. The other experienced the repetition very differently. What one person interpreted as warmth, the other experienced as pressure. What felt like kindness on one side felt intrusive on the other. Yet none of this was visible on the surface. There was no argument, no clear rejection, no moment where the routine was questioned out loud. And because of that, the routine continued unchanged. This is one of the hardest truths in investigations like this. Harm does not always come from sudden decisions. Sometimes it grows inside patterns that seem stable, patterns that feel safe precisely because they have never been challenged. When the situation was later examined, experts would focus not on a single action, but on accumulation. How emotions can build quietly when there is no release. How misunderstanding can deepen when no shared language exists to correct it. Routine can feel like protection, but it can also become a barrier. It can prevent people from noticing when circumstances shift, when tolerance turns into strain, when silence stops being neutral. By the time anyone realized that the routine meant two very different things, it was already carrying weight it was never meant to hold. And that leads to a difficult question. If safety can feel so convincing simply because nothing has gone wrong before, how do we recognize the moment when familiarity stops protecting us and starts hiding the truth? Human connection depends on shared meaning. When words fail, people rely on signals, expressions, gestures, distance, timing. These signals often feel universal, but they are not. In this story, communication existed without conversation. No explanations were exchanged. No boundaries were clarified. Meaning was inferred, not confirmed. And inference is fragile. One side believed that presence alone was respectful. Sitting quietly felt like giving space. Observing without interruption seemed considerate. The absence of demands felt generous. Every small action carried intention, even if it was never explained. But intention does not travel intact without shared understanding. Signals only work when both sides interpret them the same way. When they don't, those same signals can slowly transform into something else entirely. A glance can feel supportive, or it can feel invasive. A repeated gesture can feel reassuring, or it can feel overwhelming. A familiar routine can feel grounding, or it can feel inescapable. Without a shared language, there was no way to correct misinterpretations. No moment to say, "This is what I mean." No chance to ask, "Is this okay?" Silence filled the gap, and silence is easily misread. Over time, each side constructed a different story using the same signals. One saw mutual recognition, the other experienced constant attention. One felt connection, the other felt watched. Neither story was spoken aloud. This is how misunderstanding becomes entrenched. When nothing contradicts it, the mind assumes its interpretation is accurate. Every repeated interaction then becomes proof, not a question. Outside observers could not see this divide. From a distance, nothing appeared confrontational. There was no visible struggle, no raised voices, no signs that would trigger concern. The interactions blended into the environment, unremarkable and routine. Yet emotional experiences were moving in opposite directions. Experts later explained that prolonged exposure to unwanted signals can create internal stress. Even when those signals appear calm, the stress does not announce itself. It accumulates quietly, especially when the person experiencing it has no clear way to communicate discomfort. At the same time, the person sending those signals often becomes more confident over time. Each uneventful encounter reinforces the belief that everything is welcome, that the connection is understood, that there is no need to change. This imbalance matters, because when pressure builds without release, it looks nothing like pressure from the outside. It looks like stillness, like patience, like nothing at all. The lack of shared language was not just verbal. It extended to expectations, emotional cues, and cultural assumptions about space and expression. Each side operated within their own framework, unaware that the other was using a different one. This story forces us to confront an uncomfortable idea. Good intentions do not guarantee safety. Calm behavior does not guarantee comfort, and silence does not guarantee consent. Misunderstandings rarely announce themselves. They hide inside ordinary interactions. They grow inside routines. They wait behind signals that feel harmless to the person sending them. By the time confusion becomes visible, it is often no longer small. And that raises a question worth sitting with. If meaning depends so deeply on shared understanding, how many of our daily signals are we confident about, without ever truly knowing how they are received? Moments that change lives rarely announce themselves in advance. They arrive quietly, hidden inside ordinary movement, disguised as just another part of the routine. On this day, nothing began differently. The environment felt familiar. The rhythm was unchanged. People moved through the space with the same assumptions they carried every other time. No one sensed that the balance had already begun to strain. What makes this moment difficult to understand is that it was not sudden in the way people expect turning points to be. There was no single trigger that stood alone. Instead, it was the collision of accumulated feelings meeting an ordinary action. For one side, the routine reached its natural conclusion. Presence ended the way it always did. There was no awareness that anything had shifted beneath the surface. No reason to linger, no reason to worry. But for the other side, the same sequence felt different. Internal pressure, when held too long, does not fade. It looks for release. And when there is no language, no outlet, and no perceived escape, that pressure can distort perception itself. Ordinary behavior begins to feel amplified. Familiar signals feel sharper. Neutral actions feel charged. Experts later describe this as a breaking point created not by chaos, but by consistency. The environment played a role. Sound, movement, and shared space intensified sensations that might have remained manageable in isolation. What usually blended into the background now felt overwhelming. Small disturbances carried weight they had never carried before. And then, without warning, the routine fractured. Witnesses would later struggle to explain what they saw. not because it was fast, but because it did not match their expectations. The mind resists processing events that contradict its assumptions. For a brief moment, many people simply froze, unsure whether what they were seeing required action or understanding. Confusion spread faster than clarity. When people react without understanding, they rely on instinct. Some move away, some gather others, some remain still, hoping the moment will pass. These reactions are not planned. They emerge automatically, shaped by uncertainty. What mattered most in that instant was not intention, but impact. The accumulated misunderstanding finally surfaced, not through words, but through action. And once it did, it could not be pulled back. The routine that once felt stable collapsed under the weight it had been quietly carrying. Investigators later focused on how quickly perception shifted for everyone involved. How something familiar became alarming within moments. How trust dissolved not because it was misplaced, but because it was incomplete. This was the point of no return. Not because of a single decision, but because the system of assumptions supporting the routine could no longer hold. In the aftermath, people searched for a clear explanation, a specific mistake, a moment that could be isolated and corrected. But the truth was more unsettling. The moment was inevitable once the misunderstanding was allowed to persist without question. This is what makes the consequences so difficult to accept. Nothing dramatic needed to happen for everything to change. Only silence, only repetition, only the belief that absence of conflict meant presence of understanding. And as the immediate confusion settled into shock, a larger realization began to emerge. If a situation can feel safe right up until the moment it isn't, how many turning points pass unnoticed simply because they look too ordinary to question? When uncertainty enters a shared space, it rarely stays contained. It moves from person to person, shaped by reactions rather than facts. In this moment, clarity was absent. People sensed that something was wrong, but few understood what that meant. The human brain fills gaps quickly, often with assumptions drawn from fear or instinct. When those assumptions spread through a group, they gain momentum. Some people moved away without looking back. Others paused, trying to make sense of what they were seeing. A few instinctively gathered those closest to them, guided by the need to protect rather than to understand. These reactions were not coordinated. They overlapped, collided, and amplified one another. Crowds are powerful that way. One movement becomes many. One expression becomes a signal. Confusion turns into urgency without ever becoming explanation. Those closest to the center of the disturbance experienced something different. They were not reacting to rumors or distant impressions. They were responding to immediate sensation, noise, motion, a sudden loss of predictability. In such moments, the mind narrows its focus. Options feel limited. Time feels compressed. Yet even then, most people did not fully grasp what was happening. Later, many would describe the same event in completely different ways. Not because anyone was lying, but because perception under stress fragments. The brain records pieces, not a complete picture. It remembers feelings before details. This fragmentation complicated everything that followed. Investigators would later note how quickly assumptions replaced observation. People reacted to what they thought was occurring rather than what they could verify. That is not a failure of character. It is a human response to uncertainty. What stands out is how the environment shaped those reactions. Enclosed areas felt unsafe. Open areas felt exposed. Movement itself became both a solution and a risk. People sought distance, but distance offered no explanation. Amid the confusion, responsibility became blurred. When many people are present, no single person feels fully accountable. Each assumes someone else will step in. Someone else will understand. Someone else will act. This diffusion is subtle, but it matters. Because in moments like this, action depends on clarity. And clarity depends on understanding. Without it, even well-intentioned responses can deepen confusion. As the situation unfolded, reactions continued to shape the outcome. Not through malice, but through misinterpretation layered on top of misinterpretation. The original misunderstanding now had witnesses, each carrying their own version of what it meant. The emotional impact spread outward. Those who were not directly involved still carried the weight of what they had seen, heard, or felt. Shared confusion does not disappear when the moment ends. It lingers, replayed in fragments. What began as a private misalignment had now become a collective experience. And with that shift came a new challenge. Understanding what truly happened would require separating instinct from evidence, emotion from sequence, perception from fact. That work would not begin immediately. It rarely does, because before understanding can take place, there is always a pause, a moment where everyone asks the same quiet question, even if they never say it aloud. In the absence of clear answers, how do we decide which reactions protected us, and which ones may have unintentionally made things worse? Understanding does not arrive in the same moment as disruption. It comes later, slowly, through careful reconstruction rather than reaction. When the immediate confusion settled, attention shifted from what people felt to what could be known. This phase was quieter, more deliberate, less visible. It required patience, not urgency. Investigators began by resisting the urge to simplify. There was no single explanation that fit neatly, no clear intention that could be assigned without question. Instead, there were fragments, observations from different angles, memories shaped by stress. Each piece told a slightly different story. The task was not to find someone to blame, but to understand how the situation reached its breaking point. Experts examined patterns rather than moments. They looked at repetition, proximity, at how often similar interactions had occurred without incident. They asked not what changed that day, but what had been building long before it. One of the most difficult challenges was separating interpretation from behavior. Actions could be observed, meaning could not. The same gesture carried different weight depending on perspective. Investigators had to consider how two people could experience the same interaction in completely opposite ways. This required an uncomfortable shift in thinking. Instead of asking who was wrong, the investigation asked how misunderstanding was allowed to persist, how silence became a substitute for communication, how routine replaced reflection. Environmental factors were also considered: noise levels, visual stimuli, the presence of others. These elements do not cause outcomes on their own, but they influence emotional thresholds. They shape how stress is processed in the absence of control. Another focus was the role of observers, how collective reactions may have altered the situation without intending to, how confusion can ripple outward, changing the meaning of events as they unfold. What emerged was not a story of sudden loss of control, but one of gradual misalignment. A system in which assumptions reinforced themselves over time, where no single moment demanded correction until correction was no longer possible. This kind of conclusion is difficult to accept. It offers no clear villain, no dramatic turning point that could have been easily avoided. It suggests that the outcome was shaped by many small, unexamined decisions. That realization carries weight, because it implies that prevention is not always about intervention. Sometimes it is about attention, about asking questions early when they feel unnecessary, about recognizing discomfort even when it is not expressed. The investigation did not close with certainty, closed with insight, an understanding that meaning is fragile, and that shared spaces require shared awareness. For those who studied the case, the lesson was not about danger in unfamiliar places. It was about danger in familiarity, in assuming that repetition equals understanding. As findings were discussed, one idea returned again and again: that trust without verification is not the same as trust built on communication. And that leaves us with a question that extends beyond this story. If investigations reveal patterns rather than mistakes, are we willing to examine our own routines before they are forced into focus? The end of an investigation is not the end of impact. For many, it is only the beginning of reflection. Long after the immediate questions were addressed, the emotional weight remained. Those who had been directly involved carried memories that did not follow a clear narrative. They remembered sensations more than sequences, confusion more than clarity, a feeling that something ordinary had quietly slipped beyond control. Witnesses often struggled to explain why the experience stayed with them. Nothing in their daily lives seemed connected to it, and yet, familiar spaces no longer felt entirely neutral. Routines that once brought comfort now invited second thoughts. This is how aftermath reveals itself, not through constant distress, but through subtle shifts in perception. Some people became more cautious. They paid closer attention to behavior they might have previously ignored. Others became more aware of their own signals, how they stood, where they looked, what they assumed was being understood. For those who had believed deeply in the safety of routine, this adjustment was especially difficult. Routine had always been a source of stability. Now it carried a quiet reminder that stability can be incomplete. Experts who studied the long-term effects noted a common theme. The absence of clear intent did not lessen the emotional consequences. In some cases, it made them heavier. Without a clear reason to point to, the mind searches endlessly for meaning. Questions lingered without answers. Could something have been said sooner? Could silence have been interpreted differently? Could attention have changed the outcome? These questions are not accusations. They are attempts to regain a sense of order, to believe that understanding might restore balance. But part of the aftermath involved accepting uncertainty, accepting that not every outcome can be traced back to a single choice, that some consequences emerge from systems rather than individuals. For those who reviewed the case professionally, the aftermath informed future guidance. Emphasis shifted toward early communication, toward recognizing discomfort before it escalates, toward understanding that shared spaces require shared responsibility, even when nothing appears wrong. The story also left an impression on how trust was discussed. Trust was no longer framed as something that grows automatically over time. It was framed as something that requires maintenance, tension, willingness to question. Living with the aftermath meant carrying forward these insights, not as fear, but as awareness. And awareness changes behavior quietly. It alters how people move through familiar environments, how they interpret stillness, how they respond to signals that once felt insignificant. The impact of this story did not come from shock. It came from recognition, from seeing how easily any of us could rely on assumptions without realizing it. And as time passed, one final thought remained. If reflection is the true consequence of events like these, what responsibility do we carry to apply those lessons before misunderstanding has a chance to repeat itself? Trust is often described as something we give, but this story suggests it is also something we build and something we maintain. What lingers most is not the disruption itself, but the quiet realization that trust can exist alongside misunderstanding, that two people can occupy the same space, follow the same routine, and walk away with entirely different experiences. The investigation showed that trust cannot rely on repetition alone. Familiarity may reduce anxiety, but it does not replace understanding. When assumptions go unexamined, they harden. They begin to feel like facts. This is especially true in environments designed to feel safe. Shared spaces encourage relaxation. They suggest oversight and balance. But safety is not only structural, it is relational. It depends on awareness of others, not just ourselves. One of the most important lessons from this story is the role of attention. Not the kind that watches closely for danger, but the kind that notices subtle shifts, changes in behavior, reactions that feel slightly out of place, discomfort that does not have words yet. Trust grows healthiest when it allows for questions. Asking for clarity is not a failure of trust. It is an act of care. It acknowledges that meaning is not universal, and that silence does not always mean agreement. This story also challenges the idea that consequences require intent. Sometimes outcomes are shaped by neglect, not malice, by what is left unsaid, by what feels too small to address. For a thoughtful audience, that realization carries responsibility. It invites us to look at our own routines, to consider where we may be relying on assumptions rather than communication. to recognize that calm does not always equal comfort. The power of long investigations like this one lies in their ability to slow us down, to move beyond reaction and into reflection, to show that understanding often arrives too late, but can still shape the future. Trust, when treated carefully, can adapt, can be recalibrated. It can grow stronger through awareness rather than certainty. This story does not ask us to be suspicious. It asks us to be attentive, because in the end, the most important details are rarely hidden. They are simply overlooked. And that leaves us with one final question to carry forward. If trust depends not on time, but on understanding, what conversations are worth having sooner, even when everything seems fine?